The afternoon sun blazed through the windows of Gate 27 at Chicago O'Hare as passengers shuffled toward the jetway for Flight 482 to Portland. Among them, a man in faded jeans and a threadbare blue jacket clutched the hand of his 5-year-old daughter, whose tears had already begun before they'd even boarded. Elena Hartwell noticed them immediately as she settled into her first-class seat. The CEO of a major software corporation, she embodied success in its most polished form. A charcoal power suit that cost more than most people's rent, diamond earrings that caught the light with every turn of her head, and an air of absolute certainty about her place in the world. She watched the man struggle down the aisle, his daughter whimpering against his shoulder, and her lips pursed in disapproval. "Unbelievable," she muttered to the businessman beside her. "They really let anyone fly up here these days." The man's name was Ryan Torres, though Elena would never think to ask. At 36, he carried himself with a quietness that some mistook for weakness. His jacket, purchased from a thrift store, had a small patch on the elbow. His daughter Sophie was inconsolable, her small body shaking with sobs as they found their seats 3 rows behind Elena. "Sweetheart, remember what we talked about?" Ryan whispered, his voice gentle but firm. "The plane is safe. Daddy's right here with you." But Sophie only cried harder, her fear of flying overwhelming her ability to reason. She developed the phobia 6 months ago, right after her mother's funeral. The grief counselor said it was displacement. Unable to process the loss of her mother, Sophie had transferred her anxiety onto something she could name. Elena's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard, each tap sharp with irritation. She had a presentation to finish, a merger to finalize, deals worth millions riding on her focus. The crying was an unwelcome intrusion into her carefully controlled environment. "Excuse me," she called to a passing flight attendant, her tone brooking no argument. "Is there nothing that can be done about the noise? Some of us paid for this seat specifically for the quiet." The flight attendant, a middle-aged woman named Karen with 20 years of experience reading difficult passengers, smiled diplomatically. "I understand your frustration, ma'am. The little girl seems very upset. Perhaps headphones might help." "I shouldn't need headphones," Elena said coldly, her voice carrying deliberately. "Parents who can't control their children should fly economy. Or better yet, not fly at all until they've learned some discipline." Ryan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out a worn stuffed bunny from his bag, pressing it into Sophie's hands. "Mr. Hoppy wants to see the clouds," he told her softly. "He's counting on you to be brave." Sophie's sobs quieted to hiccups as she clutched the toy, her small fingers finding comfort in its familiar softness. In that brief moment of peace, Ryan glanced back at Elena. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for her to see the exhaustion and determination in his gaze, long enough for him to see her complete lack of sympathy. "I apologize for the disturbance," he said evenly, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to command. "My daughter lost her mother recently. She's still learning how to be brave." Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. A woman across the aisle shot Elena a disapproving look. But Elena remained unmoved, her expression neutral. Everyone had sob stories. In her experience, people used tragedy as an excuse for their failings. She'd clawed her way up from nothing. No money, no connections, no safety net, and she'd done it without making excuses or imposing on others. "Perhaps," Elena replied coolly, "you should have considered whether she was ready before purchasing tickets you clearly couldn't afford." The cabin fell silent except for Sophie's quiet sniffles. Even the businessman next to Elena looked uncomfortable. But she'd already returned to her laptop, dismissing them from her attention. The plane taxied smoothly, and for nearly 30 minutes, an uneasy peace settled over the cabin. Sophie had cried herself into an exhausted sleep against her father's chest. Ryan sat perfectly still, afraid even breathing too deeply might wake her. Then the plane dropped. Not gently but violently, a sickening lurch that sent overhead compartments flying open and unsecured items airborne. Elena's laptop crashed to the floor, the screen shattering. Karen, the flight attendant, was thrown against a seat, clutching her wrist with a cry of pain. The aircraft shuddered, banking hard right then left. Warning lights illuminated. Oxygen masks deployed with a series of sharp cracks. Passengers screamed. Through the speakers, the captain's voice crackled, professional, but unable to mask the underlying urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing serious mechanical failures. Please remain seated and secure your oxygen masks. Flight crew, take your seats immediately." Elena's fingers gripped the armrests, her knuckles white. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the plane lurched again. Beside her, the businessman was praying under his breath. Then came the announcement that would change everything. "This is Captain Mitchell. We have an emergency situation. My co-pilot is incapacitated, and we're dealing with multiple system failures. I need any passenger with military aviation experience to identify themselves to the crew immediately. Specifically, we need someone with fighter jet experience. If anyone aboard has that training, please come forward now. The cabin fell into a stunned silence broken only by Sophie's frightened whimpers. Ryan looked down at his daughter, his face pale but composed. He kissed her forehead once, then handed her carefully to the elderly woman beside them, who accepted the child without question. I'm former Captain Ryan Torres, he called out, standing despite the turbulence. U.S. Air Force. 10 years flying F-22 Raptors. 3 combat deployments. I can help. Every head swiveled toward him. Elena's mouth dropped open, her mind struggling to reconcile the struggling father she'd dismissed with the combat pilot now moving purposefully toward the cockpit. Karen, despite her injured wrist, immediately gestured him forward. This way, sir. Hurry. As Ryan passed Elena's seat, she saw him clearly for the first time. The way he moved, efficient, confident, alert. The bearing that spoke of discipline and training. The steady focus that belonged to someone who'd faced real danger and survived. The cockpit door closed behind him and the cabin erupted in nervous chatter. Elena sat frozen, her successful life suddenly feeling very small. She judged this man based on his jacket, his crying child, his apparent lack of success. And now he was literally all that stood between them and disaster. Minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. The plane continued its erratic movements but gradually, so gradually Elena wasn't sure at first, things began to smooth out. The violent lurches became controlled banks. The shuddering eased. Ryan's voice came over the intercom, calm and authoritative. Folks, this is Captain Torres. Captain Mitchell and I are working through some technical challenges, but we've got the situation stabilized. We're going to make an emergency landing back in Chicago. You might feel some unusual maneuvers as we work through our protocols, but we've done this before. Keep your masks on and stay seated. We'll have you on the ground safely within 20 minutes. Sophie, still held by the elderly woman, had stopped crying entirely. That's my daddy, she told anyone who would listen, her voice filled with simple pride. Elena closed her eyes, shame washing over her in waves. This man she'd mocked, whose child she'd called undisciplined, whose tickets she'd implied he couldn't afford, he was saving all their lives, including hers. The landing was rough. The plane touched down hard, bounced, then settled with a screech of brakes and the wail of emergency vehicles racing alongside. But they were down. They were safe. The cabin exploded in applause and relieved tears. Ryan emerged from the cockpit several minutes later, his face drawn with exhaustion, his hands trembling slightly from adrenaline. But his eyes immediately found Sophie, who flew from the elderly woman's arms into his. He held her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered because to him she was. Elena stood as he passed, words forming and dying unspoken. What could she possibly say? Ryan paused, meeting her eyes. There was no anger there, no triumph, just weariness. Your laptop, he said quietly. I'm sorry it broke. If you send me the repair bill, I'll take care of it. Might take a few months, but I'll make it right. The offer, so sincere despite everything, shattered something in Elena's carefully constructed armor. No, she managed, her voice breaking. Please. That's not. I'm the one who should. But Ryan was already moving past her, his attention entirely on his daughter, as it had been all along. Elena didn't sleep that night. She sat in her penthouse apartment, surrounded by the trappings of success, feeling more alone than she had since childhood. By morning she'd made a decision. Finding Ryan's contact information took exactly one phone call to her assistant. What took courage was actually reaching out. I owe you an apology. And probably much more. Would you be willing to meet for coffee? His response came 3 hours later. Not necessary. Everyone's safe. That's what matters. But Elena was nothing if not persistent. She wrote back, please? I need to understand how I got things so wrong. They met at a small cafe in Lincoln Park on a Saturday morning. Ryan arrived with Sophie, explaining that weekend childcare was complicated. Elena had come straight from her morning run, deliberately leaving her usual armor of designer labels at home. She bought Sophie a hot chocolate and a cookie, then sat across from Ryan, searching for words that had never come easily. I was cruel to you, she finally said. Not just rude, actively cruel. And you still saved my life. Everyone's lives. Ryan shrugged, the gesture minimizing what he'd done. You were stressed. It happens. No, Elena insisted. Don't let me off that easy. I judged you based on your clothes, your circumstances, your crying daughter. I assumed I was better than you because I have money and success. She paused. I actually rejected your resume 8 months ago when you applied for a consultant position at my company. I never looked past current employment, delivery driver. The irony settled between them like a third presence at the table. I'm offering you a job, Elena said. Not out of guilt, but because you're exactly the kind of expertise my company needs. We develop aviation safety systems. You understand flight in ways my engineers never could. Ryan smiled slightly. I appreciate it. But Sophie needs stability right now. Routine. Her preschool, our apartment, the life we've built. I can't disrupt that. Elena surprised herself with her next words. What if you worked from home most days? Flexible hours around Sophie's schedule? We could make it work. What started as coffee became conversation. They talked for 3 hours. Elena learned about Ryan's wife, Maria, a teacher who'd dreamed of writing children's books. Ryan learned about Elena's mother, who'd abandoned her to foster care when she was 8. She told him about sleeping in homeless shelters, about deciding at age 12 that she'd never be powerless again. He told her about his last mission, escorting humanitarian aid into a war zone, coming home to Maria 7 months pregnant and knowing his fighting days were over. Do you miss it? Elena asked. The flying? Ryan considered this, absently wiping chocolate from Sophie's face. I miss the clarity. Up there the mission was simple. Down here I'm never sure I'm making the right choices. 3 months later, Ryan officially joined Elena's company as a safety consultant. The arrangement was unconventional, mostly remote work, with Sophie attending the company's newly created on-site childcare when Ryan came to the office. In his first month, he identified 4 critical flaws in their systems that had gone unnoticed by engineers with decades of experience. The shift from professional to personal happened gradually. Late evenings working turned into conversations about life and loss and learning to move forward. When Sophie got sick at school and Ryan was stuck in a meeting, Elena drove across the city to pick her up, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She found herself keeping Ryan's old Air Force t-shirt after Sophie threw up on her blouse, found herself looking forward to the days he was in the office, found herself laughing at Sophie's jokes and learning to braid her hair. 6 months after the flight at a company picnic, Ryan asked if she'd like to have dinner. Just the two of them. Their first official date was miniature golf with Sophie as chaperone. Their second was pizza and a movie rated G. Their third was a company gala where Ryan was no longer just the consultant but explicitly Elena's partner. A year later, Ryan proposed in the park where they'd shared their first real conversation, with Sophie holding the ring box and barely containing her excitement. At their small wedding, Elena's vows spoke about learning that true strength wasn't about needing no one, but about being brave enough to admit when you did. Ryan's vows spoke about second chances and learning that love wasn't finite but infinite. Sophie announced to everyone that she had the best daddy and the smartest Elena, and they were all going to live happily ever after. 5 years later, Elena stood before another board meeting, this time presenting record profits and industry-leading innovation. But the achievements she treasured most weren't on the financial statements. They were in the parental leave policies, the on-site childcare, the scholarship fund she'd established for single parents pursuing aviation careers, named the Maria Torres Memorial Fund. As she looked through her office window at Ryan and Sophie waiting for their Friday lunch tradition, she thought about the woman she'd been on that plane. That woman would have been horrified by the choices she'd made since. The vulnerability she'd allowed, the priorities she'd rearranged, the life she'd built around love instead of achievement. But that woman had never known what real success felt like. As Sophie ran into her arms, chattering about her science fair project, as Ryan's hand found hers with the easy comfort of years together, Elena understood something profound. She hadn't just been saved that day on the plane. She'd been given a second chance at becoming the person she never knew she wanted to be, the person who'd finally learned that the greatest strength was choosing to land, to trust, to build something worth protecting. And that made all the difference.